Good evening. This is the Sons of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It is a modest autumn evening. The leaves are leaving us. The river Thames is turbulent. The retired centurions are in a cheerful mood. Why not? They did their 25 years. We've been debating the map phase of the empire, but we turn now to have much more fun in the 21st century. I remind everybody that this is live. You're not ahead of us now. We're with you, and we have the news from the 21st century, such as it is. For example, the signing of a ceasefire by a number of leaders in Europe, the Arab world, the Islamic world, in these last days. Mr. Erdogan of Turkey attended. Mr. Netanyahu of Israel did not, at Mr. Erdogan's recommendation. Mr. Trump was the host, no matter the fact that it was at Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a resort on the Red Sea, Egypt. That was a major event. And then the announcement from the White House that the president, after a 2-hour phone call with Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, looked to sending their counselors, I believe, to Europe this coming week to confer in setting up a meeting at Budapest, a neutral city that is lorded over by a man named Orban, who's a member of NATO and a member of EU. It is Hungary, and it was always restless under the Soviet boot. But these days, Mr. Orban is considered somewhere on the fence between Moscow and Brussels, Brussels being the headquarters of NATO. In any event, it was a surprise to hear that the two men were going to meet for the second time since the tragedy of the Ukraine conflict. Alaska was said to be unsuccessful, but now that it's led to the meeting in Budapest, if it happens, that's a positive. At the same time, Mr. Zelensky, within 24 hours of hearing about the Budapest proposal, was at the White House with his leadership, or some of it, talking about energy, weapon systems, and I can propose talking about the end of the conflict. Mr. Trump looks to be on a roll, maybe. At the same time, we have much action in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, another hemisphere, another villain. The flotilla between Puerto Rico and Venezuela is still at sea. The commander of Southcom resigned, saying he will not participate in something that's against his whatever. That's fine. They were all the 4 stars and admirals were invited to resign if they don't want to go with the program of warfighting. That was Mr. Hegseth's speech some days ago. We can anticipate that war is possible in Venezuela, but then, however, we're going to begin with something much more fun. Good evening to you, Germanicus. Carthaginian peace. We touched on it last week. I was reminding everyone that when you make peace in Carthage the way Rome did in 146 BCE, you actually do plow salt into the fields and poison the wells. You actually do this.
Yes.
You destroy all the public buildings. You execute everybody you can get your hands on. You destroy the schools and the institutions, and you curse the name of the city. 5 centuries later, Carthage is at the center of a world that includes a man named Augustine of Hippo. San Agostino, say the Italians, the man who is responsible for a great deal of the Christian theology that is orthodox here 2,000 years, 1,700 years after Augustine lived. Carthage was at the center of his life, and when his parents sent him to Carthage to continue his education, Latin grammar, that was a capstone of the moment, but it wasn't enough for him. Like Aeneas, he sailed away to Rome. He returned, but he sailed away. Carthage was nowhere recognizable as a destroyed city. It was quite prosperous, very active, had 2 Christian churches. There was a schism at the time. And it was a centerpiece of the Roman breadbasket. Not Egypt any longer. No, it was North Africa, what we now look as Tunisia, Algeria, and into Libya. The breadbasket that fed Rome, it fed the empire. So, is it possible? I'll ask a harder question. Is it credible that 5 centuries from now, or 50 years from now, or 5 years from now, Gaza will no longer be in the hands of gangsters and shakedown artists and welfare cases, but will be once again part of a prospering Middle East, all the Middle East, and Europe will depend upon it in some fashion to remain peaceful? Is it credible to you, Germanicus? Good evening.
Good evening, Gaius. The correspondence between Carthage and Gaza as kind of neuralgic fixations in the imperial consciousness of Rome on one hand, and on the other, of a kind of American-Israeli empire, is very resonant and very similar. And on the other hand, Carthage became not only part of Rome after it was destroyed, but as you pointed out so eloquently, it became essential to Rome, and Rome became dependent on Carthage. And that would be, of course, the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire, with its seat in Constantinople, was, as always, dependent on grain from Egypt. But in the Western Empire, Carthage and the wheat fields of northern Africa, above the great massif that created the lovely vineyards and wheat fields of northern, what is now Algeria, were essential to Roman life. And when the Vandals took over, and this was the time when Augustine was under such pressure because the Vandals took Carthage in the 430s, and the Romans could not get rid of them. And in fact, the Vandals, under their great king, laid waste to so much of the Mediterranean because they were essentially pirates and a piratical sea power. But eventually, the Eastern Empire, after a great failure in the mid-5th century, came back under Justinian, and Belisarius completely defeated the Vandalic kingdom in a single battle. And unlike the total prostration of Carthage under the Romans 7 centuries before, only the elite, the Vandal elite, which was a very thin elite on top of what was basically the same Carthaginian population, that elite was taken away and given nice homes to retire in Anatolia, and Carthage was returned to the bosom of the Roman Empire, and then it continued to feed that empire, especially in Italy, and this was the great turnaround. But what we see in Gaza, in contrast, is that Gaza is in no way central to the lifeblood of our civilization, and not even Israel's. It is instead a wholly symbolic artifact of contention. And the battle over Gaza is really a battle for Israel itself and Israel's capacity to assert its vision. And how that battle turns out will, I think, in many ways determine whether Israel will survive in the way that it hopes to in its vision of itself. And it has been completely dependent, much as the Western Empire, or the remnants of the Western Empire, were dependent on the Byzantines to take back Carthage in the 6th century. So Israel is completely dependent on the U.S. to preserve their vision and their apotheosis in Palestine, or what used to be called Palestine. But Eretz Israel is embarked on a program that requires the emptying of Gaza and its incorporation into Israel. And it is not clear at this point whether that will in fact happen. And so everything is now, how to put this? It's now a kind of existential, symbolic conflict and confrontation between Israel's vision and the Western understanding of just war and of a avoiding of all of the trappings of genocide, including not just killing, but also what is known affectionately as ethnic cleansing. So you have a kind of interesting and also intensely emotional moment now where you have the vision of Israel, which is indissoluble and brooks no revision or accommodation on one hand, and the vision of the West, which, if it accedes and accommodates to Israel, will by definition perforce give up the entirety of its approach to higher moral and ethical standards for the conduct of war, and thus of the entire claim on the moral high ground that Western civilization has made for the past, well, say 2 centuries.
Let me update the analogy once more. Carthage in 146 was ruled by an aristocracy, but 500 years later, it wasn't ruled by that aristocracy, but the remnant of the culture remained in a language called Punic. They called themselves Canaanites because they were descended, in their opinion, from the Phoenicians. After the destruction of Phoenicia, which they called Israel Southern Phoenicia. And anyway, Punic existed, and it was a frustration to Augustine that he couldn't speak it, that he didn't learn it. He just had the Latin. It was also a frustration to him that he couldn't pick up the Greek. It drove him crazy, Germanicus. However, the Punic remained. It becomes the Berbers.
Yes,
in the Middle Ages, and today it's Amazigh is another group. It calls itself differently. However, my point here is that the distinctions that we make now between this and that, they disappear. They remake themselves as a cultural sentimentality. And we can presume 5 centuries from now, 50 years from now, the differences of religion and language and culture and ambition can disappear. And what remains are a word here and a word there to make the congregation listen. That's what Augustine would do. He would use a word from the Punic, and they would all sit forward or stand forward, because they weren't sitting. They would stand forward in the cathedral. I could see that turning into a possible outcome and not worrying any longer about the teams today that go at each other as if the future is not, as if they'll determine the future.
I agree. And I wrote about this in the Japan Times almost 30 years ago. And I thought that over the course of historical time, that these peoples who both speak a very similar language, and that are very similar in so many ways that we need not go into, but they are of a piece, will eventually melt into something very different, but something more comfortable. But that will take 100 years or more.
Sure.
And essentially, the way in which that outcome can be fulfilled requires that there not be a forced expulsion of the people of Gaza, and
let's look
they're scattering to the winds, because that's an irony that is really too great to bear for Israel to be the agent of doing to the Palestinians what the Romans did to Israel twice, both in under Titus and in the Bar Kokhba rebellion. I can't imagine that will permit the kind of benevolent outcome that you describe.
Whatever we think, this is my last thought, whatever we think is too much, too cruel, or not enough, too benign, or appeasement, whatever we think is meaningless to the future.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, it is if it can be assuaged, if it can be overcome, because after all, in the present, meaning the far future, we are all together and we understand the water that went under the bridge. But if, on the other hand, it creates a kind of terrible wound, and here I reference what happened in the Balkans with the triumph of the Ottomans in the 14th and 15th centuries and after, and then later on the terrible massacres and crimes that were committed by everyone in that region. None of those wounds have been healed, and yet hundreds of years have passed. So I think there is a kind of inflection here that must be understood, that if the transgression is too great, that it becomes codified in the very identity of the people who are wronged, it will never disappear. And so that, I think, is the great incumbency that both the United States and Israel need to be ultimately aware of.
Can we entertain the possibility then that there is an alternative outcome in which in which the U.S. and Israel disappear?
Well, no, they won't disappear. I mean, the whole for Israel to survive, it must find a way to embrace and incorporate all of the other peoples.
About successful ends. I'm not.
Pardon me?
You're talking about a successful end for the story.
Oh, yeah. We can entertain an unsuccessful end.
Yes.
And I think that is why Israel is so focused on the existential right now, because they understand full well what the stakes are.
Well, let's talk about the Vandals. The Vandals were Christians.
Yes, of course. They were Arian Christians, but that's, I mean, the whole point. Yeah.
And they believed the Christ was entirely human. And that was the heresy.
It was.
Okay, fine. The Romans came back, and then who showed up in the 7th century? Who and where is it today? Who remembers? Right. In fact, my correspondent, Catherine Conibert, a professor of classics at Bryn Mawr College, visited Algeria to go to the site of Hippo and Tagaste, the birthplace of Augustine was Tagaste, and Hippo was his bishopric. She said, the ruins are beautiful. The French ruled as colonial masters for many years, but nobody's done anything with them. You can see the Roman city laid out at Hippo. Tagaste, there's nothing. But it's all entirely Islam. Everything. There's no memory of what she was talking about, except for the ruins at Hippo. Something was here before, but no interest, no concern whatsoever.
This is the ultimate issue here, is that when it comes to the Roman Empire in the East and North Africa, none of it remains. I mean, it has been completely expunged and wiped away.
And no memory. That's what's amazing. Without,
it's true of Asia Minor or Anatolia as well, but it is not true of the Balkans. There was and has been for centuries this deep emotional nurturing of the wrongs that were done, of the terrible experiences of Desvirme and the taking of Christian boys when they were 12, and that has never gone away. So it's a little bit bipolar. It's a little bit like a fork in the road. It can go one way or the other. But right now, for Israel to survive, it needs to embrace a path that will lead to a reconciliation and an embrace. Otherwise, we're talking about the Islamic world, and the Islamic world is like something out. It's more intense than Stalin's Soviet Union or the world of 1984. They are unrelenting, and so we somehow have to not go down that path, or it will be, as you said, the fate of Hippo.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We turn to No Kings, a demonstration of resentment and protest by many people who did not vote for the emperor. We can presume. Some who did, we can presume, when we come back. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're in Londinium. The Centurions are unhappy with us, Michael, because they had a lot of comrades who wasted their lives in North Africa. I understand, guys. Okay, fine. We were just talking about where we are today. And the remains of your city are there. And someday they'll be prosperous again. As a tourist, there are no tourists in Hippo. Are you surprised, Germanicus? No tourists. It's too dangerous. My professor was very bold to go there, but she was writing a book. When we come back, No Kings. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium. Thank you. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're by the Thames in Londinium in an autumn evening. We'll go on to sacrifice to the great god Augustus, who is the inventor of institutions that exist in the 21st century, where we spend a deal of time speculating about what comes next. We have our retired centurions who are still unhappy with us because we spoke of the remains of their North African campaigns in a fashion which we accepted, that their victories did not lead to success. Not yet, guys. Okay, we're still watching. However, we're turning now to a demonstration in the homeland. It's called No Kings. I believe it's happened before. The first time I heard of it, I thought it was some kind of betting line. I really did. I got it confused with something else, where it's a sports gambling. But No Kings turns out to have been organized across the nation, many cities, and young people especially were keen on it. They wore T-shirts and had signs and seemed in general protesting the vote of 2024, in which they must deal with a couple of facts. One, the emperor won by a majority of the American people. Two, he won the Electoral College overwhelmingly. And three, the campaign promises of 24 by the emperor are being acted upon, which seem to be the flashpoint for the No Kings protest. In other words, I don't even have to summarize that. You all get it. They're protesting the outcome of a democratic vote. Okay. However, because we're Romans, we're a little puzzled as to why young people especially are getting involved in this, because the empire doesn't overlook dissent. Never. It stays with it. It's relentless. Dissent is something that is very important to watch. The empire doesn't ever intend to be seen as weak, ever. One way to put it, in Vietnam, no matter that we lost, we were never outgunned. Never. We lost badly because our mission was fraught and inconsistent from the first, but we were never outgunned on the battlefield and won't be today. Now, Germanicus, I turn to you because you have a completely different viewpoint being in the DC area. No king seems futile and amateurish and trite, kind of cute, sort of like coming together and holding hands and singing about a better day. Do you see anything sinister in it? I couldn't find anything, although that won't bother the empire. They'll hold it against you forever until you repent, and even then you'll be suspect. But I didn't see anything sinister on the news or on the videos. Have you?
What is sinister is, in many ways, transcendent and in the ether. In other words, there's no conscious evil intent or invidious intent. The element that is sinister is or I should say, lies in or reposes in the deep ignorance of the people who created this entire enterprise, confection, perhaps. And that this ignorance is at the heart of the failure of the elite, because the elite America was always based on a high ground of knowledge, an understanding of context, of history, command of languages, a deep and abiding ability to frame arguments and visions with eloquence. And the problem with no kings is, first of all, even if we have become an empire, if we look at the Roman Empire, what did the Roman Empire hate more than anything? It was kings. The Roman Republic was founded on the overthrow of kings, and no Roman emperor would ever say in his wildest dreams that he was a king. And in fact, there's an interesting new book, and this has just come out, by Anthony Kaldelis, a Byzantine scholar, and he argues that in many ways, even in what we call Byzantium, which was really the continuation of the Roman Empire, that they were still a republic in the sense that the people were first and foremost, and the emperor served them. And the purpose of the emperor was to create a realm, a polity or politia in Greek, as the Byzantine Romans would have it, that was secure and served the interests of the citizens. And so the no kings thing is really strange, and and yet it has a provenance which none of the creators of the no kings enterprise, or like I would prefer, confection, understand, and that is that the American Revolution was not a rebellion against the rule of a king, George III. The American Revolution was a rebellion against Parliament. The king was subordinate to Parliament, a la the Glorious Revolution of 1689. George III was a constitutional monarch. Yes, he had high symbolic importance in terms of British identity and sustaining the cohesion of British society, but it was Parliament that ruled. And essentially, the colonies rebelled against Parliament. And it's fascinating that the colonies chose, however, in the Declaration of Independence, to focus on the king. And that's understandable because that is a kind of simple solution. It creates this kind of easy presentation. Oh, we're rebelling against all these excesses of the king, but that's simply not the case. Many scholars of the American Revolution have made exactly this point. And and so to have a no kings um, uh, sort of, I don't know what to call it, a happening is to compound the foolishness of not understanding these things, not understanding that th- there is no way there could be a king. First of all, an emperor is not a king, and second of all, that the whole idea of kingship is incredibly alien to the entire American experience and will never be replicated. And finally, and this is the most ironic and amusing aspect of the entire affair, is that the whole no kings enterprise had to revise their their presentation by saying, "Oh, we don't mean the constitutional monarchs in, say, Britain or Spain or the Netherlands or Saudi Arabia. This is only about the king in the U.S." It is a marvelously ignorant exercise.
Your standards are way higher than I would have thought was appropriate for the level of conversation about no kings. Come on, Germanicus. They skipped history for these kids.
I know.
They got civics lessons. What you
But
say is accurate, but it feels like here in the first century AD, it feels like men and women who know what you just said
yes.
are just smile and don't bother.
But the whole point is that um, kingship is fundamentally outside not just of the American experience, but of the entire Roman experience, in the sense that a king is the source of authority and that his word is law and that he presides over the people and knows what is best for them. And that is not what you would even see in the Roman Empire. And it's certainly not what you see today.
So what are
There
they
is,
doing? All right, you're correct. What you say is rational, but I unburden yourself. Stop being
okay.
rational. What are they? What are they? What are they organizing about? What is it really about? Let's be suspicious. What is the motive? What is the tenor? Is it just to get people excited to stay involved? I can't tell. The Obama people
Yes.
worry that they're losing the moment with the young vote that they had in 8 and 12. They worry about that. The Harris people, and she is toying with the idea of running. The Harris people want to convince the young people that they're the future, but the young people they're not educated, so they can't respond to what you're saying. So what do they think they're doing? What do the young people think they're protesting out there? It's not a king. Authority?
I
Old
think
people? Medical?
think
Medical?
I think in an inchoate way in terms of presentation, but in a far more deliberate and deceitful way of in terms of the elite motivation and objective. The insinuation really lends itself to a comparison to the latter days of the Roman Republic. In other words, it's not really about kings, it's about the big men, like, well, Crassus, Pompey, Sulla, and Caesar, that were supported by the people. It's really about the populism with a powerful leader that guess what now? Wait for it, the oligarchy is threatened by. So the whole new king's approach is that of an oligarchy that is threatened by the rise of big men who reflect the will of the people. Because, in effect, America had become an oligarchy. I mean, sure, we had a kind of president emperor, but over the last 40 or 50 years or more, there has been cemented in American life an elite rule and an elite class which has the money and therefore the power, and that they feel that they were born to rule, they are entitled to rule. And what we have seen emerge in both parties for a long time, because you saw it in the first and second Bush administrations, but you do not see it in the Trump administration, is an oligarchy on the part of Democrats, and their assumption that they control the commanding heights, all of the ruling institutions in American life. And they feel threatened by the fact that regular people have risen up and acclaimed a leader, and they want to quash that. But they can't do that any longer, as they were trying to do in the old days of Hillary Clinton or even Biden and Kamala. They can't do that any longer in terms of talking about the evils of populism and some kind of demagogic white supremacism, et cetera, et cetera. So in their desperation, they've come up with a wildly absurd, inconsistent, and unbelievable metaphor, which is no kings. And you can see that in the response in terms of memes on X and the Twitterverse. You know, the populists have leaned into that heavily, having little AI videos of Trump in a Orban scepter and an ermine robe, like he was the King of England, because they're trolling. They're making fun of this absurd accusation. And the fact that it is not only ahistorical, but it is not something that can even be entertained or understood. It's just, it is like saying Trump is Hitler, all MAGA voters are fascists. It's reached the level of incredulity. And that's why I think it's going to fall flat on its face.
We turn to another problem, which is that Washington, D.C. is no longer adequate for a government that is, let's put it this way, theoretical these days, not actual. We have the AI crowding in. There's 600 data centers just in Virginia feeding the federal government and taking jobs away from the federal workers. So therefore, just in case, Germanicus and I are going to entertain where the new capital of America empire should be. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're going to pick a city, make a case for the Constantinople of the American Empire. Gaius is John Batchelor. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We'll go on to the theater later. We're going to see a farce tonight. We're promised a new production. But right now, where do you think the capital of America should be? Because D.C. has outworn its usefulness. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here, and we're going to play a fun game, which is to look at the American Empire built upon the foundations of the Roman Empire. And it so happened at the end of the 4th century AD, 395, I believe is the date, a man named Theodosius was emperor at Ravenna. Ravenna was the capital, the effective capital at the time. Rome was no longer commodious. Milan was a large city, but Ravenna was on the Adriatic and useful way of communicating to both sides of the empire. And Theodosius knew he was going to die, so he chose his 2 sons to be emperors, one for the east and one for the west. And they were young, and so they had protectors and generals and led to civil war, of course. That's not what we're pursuing. What we're pursuing is that the beginning of the division of the empire quickly turned into ideas in the 4th century. And the ideas had to do with a man named Constantine, who had a vision, but it was a practical vision, that the Christians were no longer his enemy. I mean, he was signing up the people who were winning. Good for him. And a few years later, he founded the city of Constantinople. 330, I believe, is the date that everybody agrees upon. That became the empire's capital in the east, but really what we know to be true is that it was dominated by the Greek language, and it became the Roman Empire for the next, what is that? That's the 4th century until today. So, but really until the 15th century. And therefore, by analogy, we have to entertain the fact that the American Empire has outgrown the usefulness of DC. Right now, DC is much troubled by a population that is restive and bypassed. I picked up a detail, Germanicus. The Army-Navy Club, which is downtown Washington, you know it well. It's a lovely place. It's forever 1958, and Eisenhower's recovered from his heart attack. That's what the Army-Navy Club is like. It doesn't burden you with the digital universe. It's still telephones and messages to each other, letters writing. But in any event, the Army-Navy Club has a possibility that if you're a member and you lose your job, you can ask to have your fees for a period of time. And that's going on now, I hear. And that's because of the furloughs, layoffs, whatever you call them, of the federal workforce. The federal workforce is shrinking. And there's grave concern that a lot of people are losing their jobs. I'm thinking DC is going to lose its capital status. So where in the world do we put the new capital? Where does Constantine think we need help? Your turn, Germanicus.
Well, the first question we should ask is, why did Rome get abandoned? Why did the imperial institution leave Rome? And why did they end up in Constantinople? And that has to do with a series of crises and disasters in the 3rd century, which essentially showed Rome to be indefensible. So the choice of Constantinople was in part due to the obvious insecurity of Rome. I mean, Aurelian built a whole set of strong walls around Rome, but that didn't mean that Rome would be able to survive a real attack. And of course, that was shown to be true often, but in spite of the fact that Belisarius, 3 centuries later, was able to defend it against the Ostrogoths. But ultimately, there was another reason, and that was that the center of the imperial economy, the real heart of the Roman Empire, had moved east. There had been a significant shift. And so to find a new capital that would be closer to the heart of the real empire and also be impregnable was, I think, in large part the nexus for the decision. And this was borne out in history. And in fact, the Roman Empire in the West abandoned Rome as well and moved after Trier up in Germany when the Western Empire was still successfully defending its frontiers. It moved to Ravenna, and Ravenna was kind of a poor man's Constantinople. It was also impregnable. And the sense I would have about the U.S. today is that we need to wait for a larger transformation in American life that I think is ongoing. And what you suggest really is supported by subterranean data about the change in the nature of the American identity. And if, as is suggested metaphorically by Mr. Trump's focus on Venezuela, which actually goes back to 19th century issues about territorial disputes between Venezuela and Guyana, but ultimately, if in fact the influx of Hispanics into the U.S. and on one hand, and the desire of the U.S. to create an America first that is founded on a kind of hemispheric identity, that would tend to indicate that we would want to potentially at some point move the capital to a place that would help to cement North and South America. And of course, we have such a place, and you have suggested it, and that would be Miami. Miami is already the kind of entrepot and nexus for not just the Caribbean, but all of the world surrounding it, the world of, you might call it the Bolivarian Mexicano world. And I would imagine that would be an alternative that would help to cement a new kind of hemispheric identity. I'm not sure that is necessarily going to happen, but I do want to remind that if we ever move the capital, it will be only because the nature of American identity has dramatically transformed, and that the scope of the new identity, in which a capital is a critical symbol, capital city becomes a critical symbol, has yet to happen. But that's the way in which we would know that this is the path that we are on. Because remember, why Washington, D.C. did not exist. There was Alexandria, Virginia, quite an old colonial town, but Washington itself was a completely self-conscious creation, just as Constantinople was back in the early 4th century. Washington, D.C. was really the midway point between the northern and southern colonies. And those colonies needed a place that was not favoring the North or the South, because the capital had briefly been under the Articles of Confederation, first in Philadelphia and then in New York briefly, but that wasn't going to work. And of course, by putting the capital on the Potomac, it actually helped to increase the influence of Virginia. And Virginia was the dominant force in American politics up until the rise of Andrew Jackson. And the first party system was completely dominated by Virginia presidents. So that has an element of importance as well. So I would, if I wanted to range, as they say, broad and free, I would say that the important shift in American migration now is less that of, say, Hispanics and others coming into America, and more the migration of Northerners into the South. And the states that have been so powerfully um, increased in strength by this migration are, of course, Texas and Florida. And Florida is becoming a kind of mecca for Northerners, as it has been for some time. But I think in an accelerating way now, it is becoming a kind of locus. And at the same time, as I said earlier, Miami is really a kind of connective terminus for the world of Latin America and the United States. So yeah, you could come up with an alternative future narrative in which there was a shift. And the point you were making about Washington D.C. being so corrupted, and by implication, and also so steeped in a different kind of paradigm, which was the paradigm for the last 70 or 80 years of an American world empire and a globalized America. If there was a big transformative change to a more hemispheric and again, very traditional vision of the American space, with outliers, of course, Australia, Japan, Korea, the Azores, Greenland, all that. But it would be appropriate for this new identity to be centered in a place where North and South met, just the way Washington, D.C. originally, in the end of the 18th century, was centered as a place where North and South met.
And Mar-a-Lago is the new White House?
Mar-a-Lago is like, and I was there, not at Mar-a-Lago, I was there at Diocletian's great palace and mausoleum in Spalato or Split. And I think Mar-a-Lago will occupy a place in the new imperial institution somewhat similar to that. But it's not about Mar-a-Lago except in memorializing. But I do think that for the future, we need to keep foremost in our minds this connection between the Norte Americanos, El Norte, and the alliance that we have in our future identity with the Latin America, as they say.
All eyes October 26th, next Sunday. The vote in Argentina. All eyes on Caracas. I'm told the opposition is extremely encouraged, and the president means to win this. All eyes especially on Bogota, because Petro's out of control. And when Caracas falls to its opposition, Bogota will be tumbling afterwards. Lula da Silva is acting mighty disposed towards Washington these days. As the rest of the continent, I understand. Well, we can anticipate 1 billion people in the two continents sometime around the 22nd century. Mm-hmm. As the population shrinks in other parts of the world because of inadequate health care and also inability to industrialize, America would become not just a fortress, but a startup, a place to go to start things up. And we could also have a hemispheric vote. We can imagine that. A president from any one of the republics. However, too far into the future, the centurions are restless. We're good, guys. Thanks. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am John Batchelor. We're off to Sacrifice to Augustus. And then we're going to the theater, and we're promised a new production tonight. Now, Romans like their comedy extremely simple-minded. So I hope there's none of that irony stuff that the Greeks, excuse me, Germanicus, that the Greek irony is often burdensome for me when I'm sitting trying to laugh. You'll see if they keep it out of the production tonight. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium live. Thank you.